Welcome to the Bayesian Conspiracy. I'm Eneasz Brodsky.
I'm Steven Zuber.
And with us today, we have a special guest, Cornelius.
Hello.
Hello, Cornelius. You are joining us from Central European Time Zone, so thank you very much. I know it's pretty late over where you are.
Well, it's 9 p.m., so not too late.
I guess it depends on what you consider late. Like, my mother is old now, and she considers 9 p.m. late. But yeah, I usually don't go to bed till midnight, so...
Yeah, same. Usually I don't go to bed until after midnight.
Excellent. And normally this would be the part where we say, but first we talk about the less wrong posts, but we have changed our format recently and do the less wrong posts at the end now, so we are just going to go right into the main topic.
As soon as we do introductions.
As soon as we do introductions, yes. Cornelius,
Right.
Who are you and how do we know you?
So I am a long-time reader of Less Wrong. I was in the Bayesian Conspiracy Discord server for a while, and I've been talking on and off with Eneasz about political philosophy, especially monarchy. I'm a monarchist, which is an unusual position to have in contemporary times, of course.
Long live the Queen.
Yes.
All right.
And yes, so that's about it, I think.
So our topic today is going to be about monarchy, and I think the first thing most people will want to know is what kind of monarchy are you talking about? Is this like monarch appointed by God? Is this the figurehead that England has? What's going on?
Right. So that's a very excellent question, of course. So actually, we have the word monarchy all the way back from ancient Greek. The word hasn't changed a lot since then. I don't know how ancient Greek is pronounced, but something like monarchia. And it literally comes from soul, a word meaning soul and a word meaning command. And so it was actually quite a general term. It meant basically having one person issuing commands from the top of a hierarchy. It didn't refer to a particular form of monarchy, like European kingship. It was so anything from they were speaking strictly of government, but our concept of a CEO or a president is actually not all that different from the conception of monarchy you will find in Plato and in Aristotle. They would probably have seen these as a kind of monarch. So I have essentially two positions that I would call monarchists, and one is sort of the weaker position, and one of them is a stronger position. The weaker position is this idea that our government should have a single person wielding a lot of executive power. And here, as a president with a lot of executive power would qualify as a monarch. And then my stronger opinion is hereditary monarchy, where the monarch owns the country as personal property.
Okay.
Or private property, I guess.
So if you think that the CEO and the president count as a weaker form of monarchy, does that mean we already have monarchy in many places, in your opinion?
Yes. As a sort of hierarchical structure, basically almost any functional institution at a large scale is a monarchy. If you go to a car dealership or a restaurant or a fast food store, there's probably a single person in charge of it, wielding executive command over the organization. And this, in the broader sense, could be considered a kind of monarchy. And you will notice that this is basically in the vast majority of cases, there are some exceptions here and there, but in the vast majority of cases, this is a necessary condition to have a functional organization.
I have a quick, I guess, qualifier on that. And I don't know the specifics about like McDonald's, for example, but I believe Tesla has like a board of directors, right?
Right. So that's where that's where it gets a little bit complicated, because of course the board of directors is attempting to keep the CEO in charge, keep the CEO responsible without while still letting the CEO be in charge, right? They're not supposed to be basically micromanaging every single executive decision, or at least if they are doing that, it's probably not a good thing for for the company that it has gotten to that point. so ideally, you have a board of directors that holds an executive head of the organization accountable. But for a variety of reasons, this is actually pretty difficult to implement in terms of political governance. The American the sort of political system described in the American Constitution seems to be an attempt at doing this. You have these what are they called again?
Congressmen?
Yes, but not the congressmen. The people who elect.
The electors.
The electors. Are they just called electors?
They are just called the electors. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. You have the electors that elect the president, and these are sort of a kind of quasi board of directors, and so is the larger voting population.
But the electors only decide once every 4 years, whereas a board of directors could kick out a CEO at any time if they think he's doing a terrible job, right?
Right. I mean, you can impeach the president. So to an extent, you can also kick out a president at any point when you think the president's doing a terrible job.
You can even impeach him twice.
Yes. I'm generally favorable towards longer terms governments that stay in power for a longer time. Because what you basically have when you have a government that only stays in power for 4 years or 8 years is a lack of long-term interest in the government or in the organizational structure. So the ideal structure is if you have an executive that also has a very long-term interest in the organization.
All right. Actually, before we go to that, which is interesting in its own right, but I did want to ask before we continued there, do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea to have a board of directors that can kick out the executive? Because it seems like, to me, that goes against the idea of monarchy.
Yes, so it is a kind of limitation on monarchy as to whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. I'm not sure that's, I think that might be contingent on a lot of things. For example, what is the alternative? Is the alternative that the monarch personally has the majority? Well, not the monarch. The CEO has the majority share of the organization. I think that's actually generally, if you can have that combination of an industry that's sort of passed down. A railroad company, for example, that's passed down from generation to generation with the majority share staying within the family, where the majority shareholder also acts as the executive head of the organization. I think that's generally the ideal, because you have basically a situation there where where you avoid the principal agent problem, where the person who makes the decisions is also the person who stands to benefit or lose.
But that doesn't say anything about whether a board of directors being able to kick him out is good or bad, though, does it?
Well, so I would say that if that is the alternative, then having a board of directors to be able to kick down the executive head would probably be a degradation compared to that. It would probably not be an improvement. But if the alternative is an executive that somehow doesn't hold a majority share and still isn't accountable to a board of directors, then the board of directors is probably an improvement.
Okay, I see. Because you think that he's more impacted by the company failing.
Yes. And I think it might also, the sort of general culture of not the sort of general mass culture, but the culture within the corporate world surrounding how these relationships between board of directors and the organizations they are on the board for. I think that might also impact basically how well functioning the structure is.
Okay, well, maybe this does work for companies, and it seems like it does work at any rate. One of the reasons that we don't see as many co-ops might be this. I know that's something that comes up often on the Discord, but this is not quite the same thing as having a country where the ruler is in charge of, in the military, and if a company is run poorly and collapses, then some people lose their jobs, and that sucks, but it's not the end of the world. Whereas if a ruler rules badly, it might actually be the end of the world.
Yes, so that's the danger, right? And there's this idea you'll find among rationalists in general. They're not actually so much in favor of democracy as they're against dictatorship. You will find there are some people who are just very enamored with the idea of democracy, who believe that democracy is an ideal in itself and not just the least bad among different options. Right? You will find people who say that that a system in which people get equal representation is inherently fair, which runs into problems when you consider minorities who are always getting. Who could always be getting screwed over in a democracy without constraints on to prevent the tyranny of the majority. But there are people who are very enamored with this form of government. But the rationalist take on the need for democracy is usually that the alternative is to have a single person in charge, which is a single point of failure. It could go terribly wrong with a single point of failure, because this danger. The danger you speak of, where a country going wrong could lead to a terrible war, is really true of all ways a country could be going wrong. So what you're really getting at there is that it might be more likely to go wrong under a single executive head than under a decentralized system, right?
Maybe. I think that, I'm not a political theorist, so I'm kind of just in my mind juggling three examples. I'm basically thinking of like Tesla, where Elon Musk is sort of like the king, except he has a board of directors that he ostensibly has to answer to. And then we've got the United States, where it has all the failings, like you said, of somebody moving in for 4 years or on 4-year cycles, where 2.5 of those years are spent campaigning for re-election. And then let's look at like Russia as a third example, right? Where we've got basically a king over there who's the head of, I think, every branch of government.
Yes.
And so I think they all have their strengths and weaknesses, but those are kind of, if we can anchor in those examples, or another one, yeah.
You could say that the danger that a government might might head into a terribly destructive war. That's just the same whether it's a monarch failing or a democracy failing, right? A democracy failing could also potentially, decide to genocide a bunch of people or go into a nuclear war or similar. But people often perceive that risk to be lower because they say that if you have a monarch in charge, there's one mind that everything depends on, and that mind could go mad. Whereas they deem it less likely that an entire population in a democracy could go mad. I'm not actually sure I would deem that less likely than one head of state going mad.
Maybe a room full of people all going crazy is less likely than an entire nation or a single person. But yeah.
Yeah, we've all probably seen. We can probably all think of several cases of each of these happening.
Yeah. Before we continue, Jace, did you want to jump in with anything?
I'm just listening.
Okay. Well, you were talking about the best timeline is to have just like one person in charge for a very long time, because then they really care about the future outcomes. But I believe one of the things that a large country has to juggle is the fact that there are many vying factions within it, and it's less bitter to think that the opposing faction is in power if you know that in 5 or 10 years you might come back into power, whereas if the opposing faction gains control for an unknown number of decades, you might want to have a violent revolt to stop that.
Right, but this way of viewing factions is really a very democratic phenomenon that has arisen as a result, basically, of mass politics. Before that, you still have competing interests. You have basically interest groups. But what you see in, for example, in Cold War, in the Cold War era, you would see people writing letters to communist dictators, writing policy suggestions on how to fix the problems of USSR, right? And of course, what actually happened wasn't that we were, when USSR was in decline, and everybody could tell it was in decline, there were people who were writing how to fix these things. But of course, what happens is not that that you write suggestions and then they fix it. What happens is that the whole thing collapses, right? And the Berlin Wall, for example, it gets torn down. So the natural way for people of interest groups to think, if in the presence of basically a dictator, is to try to sway the actions of that dictator, because well, it depends actually on whether you have basically a fascist dictator or a monarchical dictator, because the difference there is that the fascist dictator is a phenomenon of mass politics who depends on the active support of a mass movement. He rules typically paramilitaristically, right? And that requires sufficient political enthusiasm in at least a segment of the population to constitute this paramilitaristic rule, right? And you can usually only foster that level of engagement by turning some portions of the population against other portions of the population. A monarch, as such, is trying to maintain a very functional civilization very long term, so that it can be profitable for him. So at least. So a monarch can have access to all the riches he wants. There's really no reason to to have a tax rate where you extract 20% of people's income as your own income, when 5% already gives you more than enough purchasing power to buy whatever you want, right? So what a monarch wants to do there is to have a stable regime where he doesn't get overthrown.
I do remember that this was the thing that really drew my attention on the Discord, that you were saying that fascism runs on mass movements which require division within a society, whereas monarchy doesn't, and so a monarch would prefer to have a united society and not divide the people against, whatever hated outgroup there is.
Right.
And that also you are very much against fascism and fascist dictatorship, which is why you want a monarchy instead, which seemed like a strange, to me that felt like a very strange contradiction, because in my mind there is I don't see a difference between a monarch dictator and a fascist dictator. They're both dictators with absolute power.
Right. So this is sort of the tricky part of this perspective to grasp, really. And it took quite a while for me to grasp this myself, especially because it gets somewhat obfuscated, because there are actually two different tendencies within neo-reaction, as people call monarchism. One faction is basically a kind of quasi-fascist faction that's very related to the alt-right. It's like a pipeline from the alt-right into advocating a basically fascist dictatorship and calling it a monarchy. And what you'll see is basically these are people who are deeply red-pilled and who would only, but actually upon further examination, they're not all that deeply red-pilled, because they would only have been red-pilled as a result of wokeism, and they would not have been red-pilled if it had still been the 90s, right? If it had been before all these woke movements came along, critical race theory, intersectional feminism, queer theory, fat studies, and disability studies, and so on. If it had been before that, a lot of these people wouldn't have been red-pilled in the first place. So it's a very sort of superficial version of monarchism. So what you'll see is, if you look at the other movement, it's really very non-fascist, because it's fascism is inherently populist, and Darwinian new reaction is what you'd call right-wing elitism. It's sort of disdainful of mass movements in general, seeing fascism as an essentially democratic movement, so that's sort of the hard intuition to grasp, because of course if you if you look at contemporary political discourse in media and in academia, you will see populism described as one of the major threats against democracy. But what we really have is a kind of democracy of the elites, where nobody would say anymore. Well, okay, some people still say that vox populi, vox Dei. That the voice of the people is the voice of God. But we see how that turned out in a lot of fascist dictatorships, where there was, popular mass support for the fascist dictator. It may not have been, the throne, so to speak, may not have been seized by democratic means exactly, but they have certainly had the support of the mass movement. So we wouldn't say now that the will of the masses is always just the way to go, because we see how that can fail. So we say instead that the masses need education, and at that point, we're actually already sort of saying that we really want the power to lie with educated people who know what is good, and the classical Greek philosophers would not call that a democracy; they would call it an oligarchy, and the sort of the things they describe as a democracy is really much more akin to what we would call populism today. So the intuition here to get is that these sort of fascist movements are actually the essence of democracy, and this sort of process-oriented system where you have experts that politicians defer to. You have Congress people who don't get switched out a lot. You have a court system with the Supreme Court, which actually is in charge of a lot of civil rights advances. All of this sort of process based system is basically an oligarchy. It's a sort of democracy of experts versus an oligarchy.
I have a very hard time arguing with that necessarily, because it does seem that everybody wants all the voters to be educated, and the traditional solution that's offered is that we should just educate everybody, but obviously that doesn't work entirely, and it kind of betrays that they do want the people who are voting to be the educated people. But on the other hand, like, I feel as soon as you take the vote away from a group of people, whether they be the uneducated or whoever they are, then you set those people up for exploitation, and I'm really not comfortable with that. And that is,
neither.
I thought, part of what democracy was supposed to stop. I'm
not comfortable with the idea of a sort of limited suffrage. I would rather just have no suffrage. The
problem is voting.
But with a monarch, you don't really have an incentive to drive factions apart, or to select one faction as your favorite group, because this creates instability. And political instability is really the bane of your existence as a monarch, because you're kind of doing quite well as a monarch financially. Even if you're only able to extract 4% of the GDP as your own income, right? That's still a lot of money, right? You could be the world's first trillionaire easily as the monarch of USA, right? So you're not really worried about getting bribes. You're not worried about financial interests. You're not. What you really want there is stability. You want to basically be able to keep this position, because if you don't keep it, but first off, there's a good chance that you lose it in some form of revolution that may or may not result in losing your head from a guillotine, and that's definitely something you want to avoid. But it could also be assassinations from various elite power groups. So you want to avoid these things by basically creating a society where people are basically content enough to not want radical change.
Well, that'd be awesome if everyone was that content, but I think you'd have a hard time making everyone that happy. I guess what I'm curious about is...
Of course, I mean, government is difficult. Governance is difficult.
Right. Jace, you had something?
Well, Stephen wasn't finished.
Oh, I was just going to say, and this might be broad, or... Well, I'll just ask. The question of succession, how do you decide who gets to be monarch, and if that person has a .45 caliber brain hemorrhage, who gets to take that person's place?
So, I would say, generally speaking, that... If the royal family is even remotely adequate, they're in a better position to handle these things than any kind of political theorist. But I would also say that these are really very long range concerns. We don't even know that
the royal family.
This assumption.
What do you mean by the royal family?
Well, there will be I advocate a hereditary monarchy. That's my sort of stronger position, whereas my weaker position is just
But what Stephen was asking is how do they get chosen? You're saying just kind of choose at random?
I'd be okay with the monarchy if I was in charge.
Okay, are you talking about... Well, I think Stephen was talking about succession of monarchs rather than the...
Well, he also said, how do you just pick, who gets to be monarch?
The succession is largely driven... in the usual case, it's driven by the previous monarch who... chooses an heir, usually, or a heir. How do you say that?
Yeah, heir.
Mute or not? Yeah.
Silent age.
Silent. That's. English is not my native language. I mess up sometimes, but So he appoints an heir, and that would be by default the successor. And typically that would be the firstborn son. There are various reasons for that, having to do with biology and um, that would be somewhat a digression to get into. But the thing is, if the monarch is genuinely sovereign, he basically has power to make a lot of decisions, and that would typically also include who. He's sovereign because he commands the loyalty of important people. Right.
So you're thinking a lot like the line of Merlin Unbroken, where a really good monarch would choose a really good successor, which was probably be one of his children, but not necessarily.
Right. And it would also probably be one of his children, just because he is, he's biased towards his children as a parent. Right? And of course, that's not a perfect situation. But the thing is,
well, Jace wanted to know who chooses who the first Merlin is.
So the first Merlin, I think. Basically, what happens is things will continue to deteriorate. It's also one of my theses is that things are getting worse, not better. We have a lot of statistics that say things are getting better. Interestingly, so did the Romans during the fall of Rome. I don't know if it was statistics exactly, but like if you look at written sources from that time, from a lot of the better off Roman citizens, their letters to each other and so on, you will find that they had absolutely no idea that Rome was falling, that Rome was in decline, and it's sort of I see the same thing right now. We have more sophisticated ways of arguing that things are getting better. We're looking at the GDP. I'm critical of the GDP as a metric for a variety of reasons, but it's so I see things are getting worse, and I believe as they get worse and worse, people will be more and more desperate. And when obviously worthy leader comes along, it will be very easy for the worthy leader to get support. And this is where it's a bit dangerous, because the first worthy leader, not the first leader that the population may deem worthy may not necessarily actually be worthy, and so the risk is that you might get a fascist dictator instead of a monarch.
Or a Donald Trump.
And that's sort of what I hope to not happen. I think we have a lower risk at the moment of that happening, because people are still sort of our culture still remembers Hitler and Stalin and doesn't want to repeat this sort of faction-based, very ideological leadership. I think they will prefer to go for somebody very sober, at least if they have the choice between some rabid ideologue and a very sober leader.
It doesn't seem to be the trend in leaders that we've been choosing.
No, but I don't think...
Or elevating to positions of power.
I think if presidents had more power than they do, I think if they actually had something like absolute power, I think a lot more people would be hesitant to vote for Trump. I think actually the sort of limited power of the presidency has made people less reluctant to vote for Trump than they otherwise would have been.
That's a charitable take. I'd have to think about that.
Yes, but I'm not sure this is a particularly solvable thing. I don't think it's. I don't think the present world order can be saved. I'm not really, I'm sort of seeing the deterioration as basically irreversible at this point, and the whole thing is going to collapse eventually. I don't really know of any ways of optimizing your relative likelihood of getting a sober monarch relative to a fascist dictator, except maybe, advocating this form of government as I'm doing now.
Is there anyone that you think would probably make a decent sober monarch?
Me.
Aside from Stephen?
I would say you want somebody with a lot of management experience. So you could go through a list of CEOs, or Curtis Yarvin was actually asked the same question on in a podcast with Michael Mellis, and he thought a bit, and he gave the answer Gordon Ramsay, because he would go into into the State Department's
I would watch that TV show.
Go into the State Department's walk-in freezer and see all the all the rotten food they have there, and be like, "You're funding this agency? Why the fuck are you funding this agency?" Wait, can I swear on this show?
Oh yeah, totally. It's a podcast, and we swear all the fucking time. So. Okay,
so they'd be like, so you'd have Gordon Ramsay, who'd be like, let's take a look at the State Department's walk-in freezer and and he'd be like, within a moment, he'd be like, "What the fuck is this? Why are you funding this guy? Stop funding this guy." And so that was the answer Curtis Yarvin gave. I think you can, of course, do better than Gordon Ramsay. I think he was giving it partly in jest, but also he had to choose somebody that people know and recognize, right? If he just chose some CEO somewhere on the Fortune 500 list, right?
Yeah. So it seems like one of your major thinking points here is that an absolute monarch would do a better job of stabilizing society and giving people enough contentment in their lives that they don't want a major revolution than our current democratic system does.
Right. But I think it's also it's also a matter of, I see basically the status quo as essentially dystopian, which is not how most people see it. But I think most people are very distracted by culture war, and which makes them feel important and sort of distracts them from really how depressing and dystopian the status quo is. And so I see. So in a sense, this kind of Yarvinian monarchism is basically a kind of disillusioned libertarianism, right? Libertarians are very often very critical of the sort of New Deal, post-New Deal era, where we have this giant state that doesn't allow you to do anything pretty much, because everything is held in a regulatory stranglehold. I mean, it's very difficult to build a factory, for example, and there's a massive tax burden and massive barriers to entrepreneurship in general. But what you'll notice is that libertarians tend to be quite intelligent. Whether you agree with them or not, you can usually tell that they're pretty intelligent. But you'll also notice that they're not really making a lot of progress.
Yeah, understatement of the year.
They're not winning, right? So this kind of monarchism is basically libertarianism that has gotten tired of not winning, right?
But since libertarianism is so unpopular, wouldn't that necessitate some sort of military coup and installing someone that is not popular and thus a recipe for disaster?
Right. So you basically get in trouble when you have these paramilitaristic coups. It's very heavily implied in Curtis Yarvin. He never states it explicitly. I guess I'm gonna reveal the big secret here, but it is that whereas a fascist dictator rules paramilitaristically, a monarch principally rules militaristically. So yes, it is a fundamentally militaristic form of government. But this is quite different from what we associate with government by force, because what we associate with government by force is really more paramilitaristic. It's really more like because the military is really a natural aristocracy. It develops a lot of very great virtues that just do not exist in paramilitaristic forces. And so it is just, New Reaction in general, has this basically, Machiavellian analysis of politics and governance, where it is understood that any form of governance involves significant coercion, including these liberal democratic, governments, that permeate the Western world. And sort of the intuition here is that it is better to have honest militaristic coercion than either dishonest, like hidden militaristic coercion, or honest paramilitaristic coercion, or even dishonest paramilitaristic coercion. You want it to basically be as honest and legitimate as possible. Because so the idea is basically you cannot avoid having a substantial coercion as a basis of government. So you want it to at least be honest.
Interesting. Okay.
I don't think we're going to be able to settle the idea of who gets to take charge first, or how that would work. Yeah. If it is a militaristic uprising, it's just going to be the biggest group with the most guns. And
that would be a paramilitary.
That would be the paramilitaristic thing. It would just be literally the army, the existing army, and there are a lot of institutions that would have to be remade, but it would be very top down. It would not be random soldiers in charge of this. If this would be the top people in the army, which are so USA is a bit problematic because it's I don't think you would have a militaristic coup. I don't think you would have a militaristic coup in USA, and I don't think it would be advisable to have one. So this is more after the monarch has gotten in charge. It is a sort of fundamentally militaristic form of government after having been instated. But I think it would be instated basically through democratic means. And of course, I'm not very favorable to that because to me, democratic means quasi-fascist, and this is basically the point where it's most likely to go wrong. Is the instation, the initial instation of the monarch. That's where the sort of danger lies, because when you democratically put a monarch in charge, that's a process that's not too dissimilar from democratically putting a fascist dictator in charge. Ideally, you should have to some extent bipartisan support of the monarchical dictator. You cannot elect a monarch in spite of half the population. You can, however, elect a monarch in spite of 20% of the population or something. You don't need like full or 30% or whatever. You don't need full majority support in both factions, but you do at least need it to you can have one faction that's mostly in favor and another faction that's divided. That can work.
So basically, the monarch is the head of the military, and the military runs the government.
Yes. Military and police, of course. So the military is a kind of so the function of government is to monopolize violence, and this is of course what anarcho-capitalists also believe, and they believe that this is a bad idea, that we shouldn't have a monopoly of violence. They believe in the non-aggression principle, and they have various ideas on how the non-aggression principle can be enforced in a decentralized way. I don't think the non-aggression principle can be enforced in a decentralized way. I think you basically need, a monopoly on violence because the alternative to having a monopoly of violence is to have polycentric violence, which is the definition of war. Right? It's like you have. If you don't have a monopoly on violence, it's either because you have nations at war, or it's because there's gang wars.
Okay.
Yes, rulership happens through. It can happen basically either through force or through persuasion. And in this sort of civilized era, we might think that persuasion sounds a lot better than rulership through force. Except that persuasion does not actually have to be voluntary. What rulership through persuasion means is thought control. It means rulership through thought control, and that's a very sort of totalitarian premise.
I want to back up and tie this to a thing that you said earlier about a monarchy would be better at providing for its citizens because it wants stability and it doesn't want its citizens fighting each other. But then you also say that a monarchy rules primarily through force and that this is okay. I don't see how, if they're ruling through force and they're keeping stability through force, what makes you think there's an incentive to also make the citizens as best off as possible?
Because in general, you just cannot have a government that stays in power if it's hated by all its subjects. It just doesn't work. You could maybe maintain that state of affairs for a while, but riots will get more and more intense, and eventually it just won't work. It will just sort of break down.
But in a monarchy, if something is breaking down, the way to change governments is a violent revolution of some kind, whereas in a non-monarchy, you can vote or something, which I think is much better because it leaves our citizens.
What I would say there is voting doesn't really change the power structure. That's why this works. The amount of chaos involved in a change of power is basically just a function of how thorough this change of power is, how much power is actually shifting. Although you can sometimes do these very orderly changes of power, like the fall of the Berlin Wall wasn't very chaotic. It's because there was a West Germany to be reabsorbed into. And similarly, what I'm advocating is a kind of it's actually a very, very peaceful kind of revolution. It's I don't believe in this guillotining the old elite or whatever, or putting them in prison. It's that's nonsense, and it's staying within the same frame of political conflicts that the revolution is supposed to end.
All right, so I do very much agree that there is not much change that happens when we have elections, no matter who wins. And the last time there was an actual change in the power group was when Trump was elected, and there was massive amounts of chaos.
I don't agree there. I don't think there was a change either.
Trump himself was outside of the everyone else who was still part of the same power group, and which is
Trump
why he failed at everything.
Yeah, and so what that basically tells you is that Trump didn't have power because he was so far outside that he would have done everything differently, and of course things didn't change all that much. Even the people literally working in the government, most of them, their lives were almost entirely unchanged.
Yeah.
Right? They were following the same procedures as before because the whole thing is this entrenched bureaucracy that is like rigid and sclerotic and cannot be changed. Or at least not by Trump. You'd need somebody who's more more insistent and all in.
So is the argument that our current democratic system is really more of a farce and like a circus to keep us distracted while the same ruling party keeps ruling for decades upon decades?
Oh, yes, absolutely, yes. I would say that the last change in power was the FDR administration. There was the last regime change, and it's still sort of and you can really trace the current regime further back than that. It's sort of I guess I would call that the last change of government. The last sort of change in dynasty would be with the English descendants settling in America.
So if we already have that sort of single party power elite rule, then why would changing to a monarchy as opposed to our system make a difference or make it better?
So it's partly it's that that this regime is very old and things, whether they're biological beings or whether they're governments, they tend to get sicker with age, and that's basically what has happened. So part of it is just that this thing is old. I'm not saying that whatever comes next will last forever, and that even 500 years from now it will still be superior to what we have now. It will probably also undergo a slow deterioration, and eventually will need to be replaced too. And this is, of course, something that the founders of the founding fathers understood quite well when they included the right to bear arms as part of the Bill of Rights. It's that's basically an understanding that even these processes of peaceful regime change that we've encoded into the Constitution, that these are probably going to fail eventually, and eventually you will need a revolution. Of course, ideally we should have a revolution that doesn't involve a single shot fired. So the right to bear arms may not be particularly necessary in that respect, but that's basically the intuition that regimes deteriorate over time and eventually need replacement.
I think as far as your other question too about like what would make the new system better, other than just being fresh, might just be like a monarch could actually get shit done because they're not accountable to like the public or whatever, right?
Exactly. So what we have right now is we have entrenched bureaucracy with a whole bunch of agencies. So that for the most part, people don't even really know what the agencies are doing, right? They know that there's a very, very large amount of money being poured into the system, and they know that some of the money ends up in like welfare checks, some of it ends up in healthcare, and some of it ends up in the military-industrial complex, right? But even in the systems where there's transparency, the whole thing is just so complex and intractable that people don't actually know where this money is going. The whole thing is this very deeply entrenched system, and it takes up a very, very large part of the GDP. I mean, historically, a tax rate of 20% would be like almost unthinkably oppressive before the advent of the New Deal dynasty, as I call it.
I don't know exactly how much power you see the monarch having, but one person only has so many hours in the day. Like, wouldn't this monarch necessarily have a lot less power than our government does in total right now?
There are two things we sort of conflate. We tend to conflate when we think of how large a government is. One is basically executive power, and the other is basically the size of the whole thing, right? The size of the bureaucracy, the bureaucratic bloats, as I call it. But when you have a more bloated bureaucracy, actually it means the government has less executive power because it's just much more difficult to direct this sluggish, massive thing than it is to direct something more concentrated. So there's a trade-off there actually between government size and government power.
So would the monarch just have to drastically reduce the size of government to make it steerable by one person again?
Yes, and that's also the point of having the government. It's actually, so this is a bit backwards actually. The whole point is basically a libertarian perspective. So it started with the 2001 book by Hans Hermann Hoppe, Democracy, the God That Failed, where he basically explains that actually sort of the real historical libertarianism is just monarchism. Of course, he's an anarcho-capitalist. He's not a monarchist, or at least he thinks he's not a monarchist. I think his anarcho-capitalism would actually look a lot like a whole bunch of small monarchies, but he's basically showing how monarchism is analogous to privately owned government. He says, I think it would be more accurate to say a privately owned nation, and democracy is analogous to a publicly owned government or nation, right? And so if you're a libertarian, you're quite annoyed with the New Deal regime, with this whole thing where you have an absolutely massive tax burden. And if you look at tax incidence, you'll see actually that low income groups often end up effectively paying taxes twice, not quite twice, but almost twice, because of course, they tend to be providing services that people can do themselves. And because it's part of what it is to have a low skilled job. And they tend to be lower income groups, so they only buy goods that are necessities and therefore have inelastic demand. So that means that the tax burden falls on them when they're buying goods, and it also falls on them when they're selling their services. So actually you see this situation where low income groups basically pay taxes twice, because of how tax incidence works. And that gets quite oppressive when you have a tax rate that's as massive as the one we have. And of course it goes to like, pay a whole bunch of bureaucrats that paraphrasing Yudkowsky here, wouldn't have any work if they weren't all stopping each other from getting anything done. So basically, if you look at what would be necessary to disentangle this, right? This very awesome quote from Thomas Carlyle, actually. What these strange entities in Downing Street intrinsically are, who made them, why they were made, how they do their function, and what their function, so huge in appearance, may in net result amount to, is probably known to no mortal. The unofficial mind passes by in dark wonder, not pretending to know. The official mind must not blab. The official mind, restricted to its own square foot of territory in the vast labyrinth, is probably itself dark and unable to blab. We see the outcome, the mechanism we do not see. So it's this very, very complex machine. And it's like, if you imagine the process of tearing down a lot of these agencies and like bringing them down to their original purpose, and just sort of fixing things, right? Fixing all these things that libertarians complain about, because this is a basically libertarian movement. The process you're imagining there is not a process that can be done by procedure. It's not something that can, and it's not something that can be done by a Donald Trump or some such. And it's not something that can happen through incremental change where you elect, libertarian presidents and they like reduce the size of government little by little. If you actually imagine what it would involve to go over each agency and figure out, okay, how do we reform this agency to make it more effective and smaller, right? If you imagine that process, what you're imagining is most likely the work of a single mind wielding supreme executive power. What you're actually imagining is a dictator who has the power to just institute the reforms he wants to institute, right? And that's basically why a monarch is needed, because
where does that power come from? Because like it doesn't come from God. He still needs people to listen to him and do what he says. And if he doesn't have these bureaucracies on his side, why would they listen to him?
So that's sort of the thing that gives us a chance of having a sort of monarchical dictator rather than a fascist one. If you have only like very partisan support, it probably won't be enough. If you have 70, 75, 80% of the population, then I mean, you sort of go into Congress and you just go in there and you're like, stop whatever you're doing and walk out. I have like 80% of the population on my side, and none of you will be prosecuted. You haven't done anything wrong. You've just like done your job. We we don't hate you. Actually, we love you, and we understand that you don't even like your jobs, right? I mean, if you look at like how many of them actually enjoy their jobs, it's probably not a lot of them, right? And like, it's like, what are they going to do? Are they going to like barricade themselves in Congress and be like, we will never surrender? Right? It's like, I don't think it's very difficult to, for a genuinely popular, prospective monarch to assume power. I don't think that's going to realistically be a stumbling block. As for like the exact method he would use, well, I think frankly he would be in a better position to decide that than I am.
Okay, so that's why you're saying this would have to happen after a massive collapse of society, because that's the only way you'd get that much popular support.
Yeah. This kind of so the last dictator that USA had would be Franklin D. Roosevelt, and if you look at his speeches, he's basically saying that I am fully prepared, if necessary, to declare a state of emergency and just like declare martial law to address, the Great Depression. And it's like, okay.
Why? So you're not a fan of FDR though. Like, why would you think that a monarch that comes into power would be more like someone you would like as opposed to someone like FDR?
Because we've already had FDR, and people have seen how that works out. I don't think the idea of New Deal has as much popular support as it did back then. So it's really just historical accident that it would go differently this time. There's nothing inherent about the process that prevents FDRs. It's just like at the time, New Dealism was quite popular, and now it isn't.
So what do you think is going, if I just don't mind me going off a total tangent here, what do you think is going to happen with Russia, seeing as they have a monarch and he appears to be pretty popular, but he's also making what look like really bad decisions that are dragging Russia into a new dark age? So
I kind of prefer not to comment too much on issues that are sort of hot button topics right now, because I believe like people are actually noticeably less, I would say that people were noticeably less rational about, COVID back when the lockdowns were still going on, than they are now in retrospect. Right. And I believe this is a similar thing. What I will say is that, I have a perspective that differs considerably from what you will find in Western media, and is more like you would find in Indian media.
Huh. Okay.
And then, readers who are curious can like find Indian media commentators on the whole situation.
Well, if you are trying to chase down some of that rage clicks, you're welcome to elaborate, but no pressure.
I prefer not to. I might in the future elaborate on my blog, but on my Substack, which I guess I could, I should plug right now, esotericmusings.substack.com, and it will be in the show's description, I hope.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Okay, great. So check that out. I will probably eventually, write a post about the whole, Russia-Ukraine situation. Although actually, one thing I will say that might get a little bit of rage clicks is, to fathom a complicated plot, look at what happens and ask who benefits. So what we have here is a devastating war between Russia and Ukraine. We see it's like absolutely devastating to both Russia and Ukraine. But one country it's not particularly devastating to, and one country's government in particular it's not devastating to is the American government is actually not particularly devastated by this. It's actually a very convenient distraction from domestic problems. And I'm not sure if I would go so far as to say that that USA and NATO have literally like manipulated Ukraine and Russia to go to war, but I also won't say that they haven't.
But you're not saying that. Yeah.
Okay.
It's something I sort of consider a distinct possibility.
It sure sounds like the kind of thing we would have done. So yeah, I can see how that sounds plausible.
Oh
wait, what were we gonna say, Jace?
To Inyash's point, without bringing Russia and Ukraine into it, what I'm concerned is about, like, with this absolutist system, what is there keeping like the inevitable psychopath or idiot or narcissistic, like megalomaniacal CEO from making bad decisions?
Right. So I'm actually, this is a great question. And it was actually a point I wanted to touch on. So it's great that you asked this. Because as, because there's basically, this trade-off, people perceive. They say that, of course, a benevolent dictator would be the ideal system, at least, well, a wise and benevolent dictator. Just being benevolent, of course, isn't enough if the dictator is unwise. But what they'll also say is that they fear it would be unstable. So they sort of conceive of a kind of trade-off, between stability and competence. And I guess if you select for birth, they will also tend to come apart at the tails, right? Which happens when you have, even if you have correlated things. And I think these things actually are correlated, that the competence for government is correlated with its stability. And I think this is not a particularly hard case to make. Like, you just sort of look at competent governments and you look at incompetent governments and you ask yourself which one seems more stable, right? And I think it will paint a pretty clear picture. But I think also we have this sort of idea that, the status quo is basically eternal. And it's not necessarily something we hold at a rational level, but at a sort of pre-rational or instinctual level. We have this sense that this is how it's always been and this is how it's always going to be. So we sort of imagine the status quo stretching out eternally, but actually the status quo isn't Lindy, right? So the Lindy effect is basically the expected lifespan of something is proportional to its current age. We don't actually know that the current system is more stable than hereditary monarchy. And I don't think it is. I don't think that, I think that the current system has a distinct failure mode of being prone to producing, fascist, movements. And that it could very well turn into a fascist dictatorship.
Wow. You
it
keep
is
using
unstable in that sense.
Yeah, you keep using stable and unstable. Could you define what you mean by those?
So, I mean, stable in the quite literal sense, where a stable government is a government that remains in power. It's sort of as governmental structure that remains the same over time, whereas an unstable one is one that changes drastically. And so we see this idea, okay, we can see why a benevolent and wise monarch would be a great form of government. But people are concerned that it would be unstable, that you might not have a benevolent and wise monarch after a few generations, right? But a few generations is a long time. A monarch can have a very long reign, right? It's like, if it breaks down after, I guess I just don't really have the luxury of being concerned with whether it breaks down 80 years from now, right? It's, I'm more concerned with, because as I see it, the status quo is already breaking down and we need to address that. I don't see democracy as particularly stable. I actually see democracy as quite unstable because it's prone to creating, partisanship, and like creating these, mass movements that hate each other. And I think this is a very major source of instability, of political instability. When you have competing movements, it's just a lot more unstable than when you don't have these mass movements.
And you don't think there would be competing movements like that in a monarchy?
I think there would be competing, interest groups. I don't think you would have mass movements, because first of all, historically it didn't. Like, historically you just had like, you have had a lot more sort of more fractal structure of government, where you'd have more local governments. You'd have like a mayor or something, or a feudal lord or something, and it would, as sort of intermediate stages, between an ordinary resident in the nation, and the monarch at the top. There would be like more stages in between. And so the whole sort of process of government would feel even further removed than it does now, right? Right now it feels removed in the sense that it's quite abstract what actually happens in this complicated New Deal bureaucracy. But it also feels very close in that, people participate in elections and you're supposed to have an opinion about topics. Whereas if you just sort of pay, pay 4 or 5% of your income as taxes to the monarch, and you pay like another 4 or 5% to like your mayor, then then it's like you're going to be like relatively indifferent actually to the politics at the national level. And you're going to see basically politics as being, the king's concerns, and you're just going to be like, I don't get paid enough to start to worry about politics. This is a lot of work, and I have no particular incentive in doing this.
Don't the common people often get drafted into the fights between interest groups, though?
Well, actually, no. Or at least not into the armies. Maybe maybe some. I mean, I gotta admit, I'm sort of veering a bit from my from familiar ground when I go into arguments from history, because I'm not much of a historian yet. I'm working on it though. But in
like, I'm thinking specifically, I don't know if this was a historic anomaly or if this is common, so maybe this is a bad example, but I was thinking of the War of the Roses period, where everybody in a major city would have roses of one color or the other to show, whose side they are on, and there would be duels in the streets between opposing factions.
Yeah, I think I'm not very familiar with this historical period, but my guess would be that these factions was mainly was mainly the nobility, and that the sort of working masses just didn't really care, because that's usually how these things work. And like even today, when you see when you look at the people who are most engaged in politics, people who are constantly posting, basically virtue signaling on Facebook and Twitter, it's the people with college degrees, and the people and college, the sort of college educated class is basically a contemporary nobility. It's they have their college degrees are basically a title of nobility that entitles them to hold public office and to matter in society, and what that is just it's a title of nobility. And you will see when people write their college application essays, they'll be like talking about how they want to make a difference, they want to improve the world, they want to whatever, and what that basically translates into is they want to rule, right? They want power, and they want power and relevance, and these are like very sort of these are noble ambitions. This is like how a noble thinks, and you'll see this like throughout history. This is how nobles think throughout history, and even now, these are the people who are most fervently engaged in politics. Of course, the working masses are also engaged in politics now. I would say that's largely because the working masses are not doing particularly well. They're rather discontent with the very, very high tax rates by historical standard, and with all the regulations that are, and with all the, witch hunts, moral crusades, and this is sort of what's engaging the working class. The working classes wouldn't really care if they weren't basically being forced to care.
I'm not sure if we're gonna have time to go into this, but this is actually a thing that I wanted to touch on, and you touched on it right now, so I guess we could bring it up. Earlier, you had talked about how you like that monarchy is at least a honest military force rule, whereas all the other ways are dishonest, deceitful, and you say the same thing about the caste system that we have, where I think your argument is that we have an informal caste system, which you were just talking about, which is the college educated elite, the aristocrats, and the normal working day folk, and that you would much prefer for us to have a formalized caste system rather than this informal one.
I think it's caste.
So this is actually.
Oh, I'm sorry, it's caste. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's caste. Yeah.
My
So
bad.
these. So this is actually an area where I'm gonna borrow a little bit of Marxist rhetoric and talk about class consciousness. If you have basically formalized systems where everybody can tell what is going on and who has power, and like who is this sort of privileged class with power and who isn't, right? Right now you have like Harvard students complaining about being marginalized, and it's like if you're in a Harvard University, then you're not marginalized. You might be discriminated against, but you're not marginalized. Marginalized means being shoved to the margins of society, and Harvard University is not the margins of society. So if you have a sort of very clear, very sort of honest system, what happens is you will have a kind of very very sort of true class consciousness. This is other term. It's really a very toxic term, but false consciousness. And of course, I disagree a lot about what constitutes false consciousness compared to the people who use these terms more frequently. But if you have a very honest system, you will have not a lot of false consciousness. You will have very sort of clear class consciousness. You will have, if you have a monarch who is a monarch because he inherited the title from his father, right? And it's just very clear that an ordinary person has no chance on earth of becoming king, right? If you have that situation, it fosters a class consciousness. It's like there's a clear sort of class difference between the royalty and the rest of the population, and the rest of the population is not going to think of the royalty as just an extension of them, right? When people talk about what the government should do, what they will use phrases like we should, what would they say? We should
we should make that illegal.
We should reform the healthcare system. We should, we should reform the healthcare system. We should increase gun rights. We should reel in gun rights. We should whatever it might be. And this "we" is actually it's kind of inaccurate because these processes of governing actually have very little to do with most of the people. If you say "we should," it's like and in a monarchy, people wouldn't be making this mistake. They would be like. The king should do this, maybe, if they're talking about what the king should do. And they would also probably feel a bit more silly because they'd probably realize that the king doesn't really care about what some random person says the king should do, right?
Or they could say, or they should, the nobles should, our local prince should.
Right. And so they're not gonna have, in this sense, the same kind of, they're not gonna have the same loyalty to the government that we do now. We have this sort of sense that the government and the nation are basically synonymous and they are us. Right. We are the nation, we are the government.
Isn't that a strength of current nations, though? Like, that's what makes them able to unite a lot of people in wars and take over other countries.
Yeah, I'm generally not very keen on warmongering.
Well, I mean, I'm not either, but also, if you don't have a strong nation to defend yourself, then the warmongering nations near you will.
Exactly.
I think having a strong nation to defend yourself, the first and foremost thing is to have a nation that's more competent than the other nations, right? Even if you cannot draft as large an army, if you can only get an army by paying people the market prices of their work, right? If that's the only way you can build an army, that's still going to be fine if your technology, if your military technology is just way better than all the other countries, right? So the first and foremost thing you want to do to be a strong nation is to be a very well functioning nation that has a lot of that produces effective military technology that produces basically lots of aristocrats and is generally a well functioning nation if you have such a nation, you will be a stronger military power than nations that aren't, assuming comparable size. Right? Even if your army is smaller.
But technology isn't that contained. Like you need a lot of inputs from around the world to make most things.
But I mean, there's also the strength of your industry and just the effectiveness of your economy, how wealthy your nation is a very major factor in your nation's military strength. It's just how wealthy is it.
I mean, it sounds a lot like this is something that would probably work well as a government system in a world where there weren't a lot of other competing nations of equal strength. Like either a world that's already pretty much united, or one where you are unambiguously the biggest nation there is. If
you're literally getting invaded, then a monarch would possibly institute conscription to defend. It seems likely that. In such a case, a monarch would be able to amass an army that's comparable in size to a non-monarchical nation. But conscripts are pretty useless on the battlefield. But you'd also have that's also a reason why Hans Hermann Hoppe specifically cites that as a reason for why conscription is basically a democratic phenomenon and only happens sporadically and rarely and in limited scope in monarchies. Basically, you were much less likely to get drafted into a war in a monarchical era. It's so. I mean, first of all, you'd probably form alliances with nations. I mean, you could. I mean, if you have a very well functioning society, I don't think you will have a hard time forming effective military alliances with other well functioning societies. And I think generally speaking. how well functioning a society is, how well functioning its government is very correlated across different metrics of performance, like different let's say different skills the government has, right? And I think if you have a generally competent government, it's going to be a powerful military as well. It's going to be militaristically powerful, and I'm not sure exactly how that plays out in the case of monarchy, but I don't think that's going to be a pitfall of monarchy. I would be surprised if that was a pitfall, if that's where it falls down.
I don't know. It seems to me like nationalism is a very powerful military force, and I know that like the most popular monarch that keeps being brought up is the ruler of Singapore, whose name is escaping me right now.
Lee Kuan Yew.
Yeah, there we go. But Singapore was a small island nation that was pretty much ethnically homogenous and didn't have any military threats at the time. So it's not like it's not like that would necessarily scale to a larger population and a larger geographic area.
Well, I mean, you can always just like you can always just like form an army through being very wealthy and you know and paying citizens to be to join the army. And that way, you get higher quality soldiers than if you're just if you're doing a sort of haphazard draft where you're drafting a whole bunch of untrained soldiers, giving them like a couple of weeks of training because you're already at war by the time you're doing the conscription. Right?
No, I mean, sure, but I'm not sure I completely agree with the premise. A lot of the premise seems to be that like we will have more money. The monarch is motivated by his personal wealth and the wealth of his nation, and we can pay for more soldiers. And I'm not sure wealth is such a big driving force. Like nationalism seems much like a stronger one.
More soldiers, more drones, more weaponry, more tanks, more fighter planes, more like all of the stuff. It's like soldiers are not the only part of this size of the army that is relevant.
And nationalism might soar if like your neighbor's house explodes and the next town over gets set on fire. So like
true.
If you're being invaded,
I think people come together.
Yeah.
If you're especially if you're in a very functional monarchy, and you just like even if you don't really care about it as politics, but you're in a very well functioning monarchy, and you're getting invaded by something that isn't a monarchy and therefore is less functional.
So what's the advantage of a formalized caste system?
So the advantage there is it's more honest than a sort of informal caste system, and that produces more consciousness of it. It makes it easier to fix it. Right? Like if you formalize it, it's easier to fix it because you can see what's there. It's more visible. But also this is saying about how most people don't want freedom; they just want security and safety, right? And the formal caste system can actually implement this. It can actually like let the people who want freedom be free and the people who want safety and security be safe and secure. Right.
Okay, so it's not a born into caste system. It's a thing where you could choose to move between the castes.
Well, I would say, it shouldn't be like too easy to move between the castes because then people would do it situationally just to get the perks of like one caste one day and then the perks of the other caste the other day, and then it becomes like just weird. You might as well just give everybody those perks regardless. But it's but yes, I would say that people should be able to move, not necessarily easily.
Maybe a process that takes a number of years.
Yeah, it may be something that you buy membership into the noble caste or something.
Okay,
but it is hereditary.
Or you could lose it if you don't uphold the codes of nobility or whatever.
Yeah, and it's so. I don't know if you've read Ayn Rand. It's really quite interesting because like her Atlas Shrugged is basically a hate polemic. In addition to other things, it's also a hate polemic. It's a hate polemic against basically, she calls them second-handers and looters, which are very prejudicial terms. I call them communitarians. And communitarians, what you'll notice about them is they can actually be very nice people and very pleasant to be around. They shouldn't have power. It's generally unhealthy to give them too much power. But if they just if they're just sort of thriving in the communities, in the local communities where they they stand together and they like help each other out when they're in trouble, they can actually be very pleasant. They have this almost hobbit-like way of life. And I don't say that with any kind of condescension. I like these people when they're when they're thriving, right?
You seem to
I'm in a.
you seem to also have said that, at least if I recall correctly, about the current aristocracy that we had, that they're great people, but they shouldn't have power.
Right. So the thing about our current aristocracy is that a lot of them are basically communitarians by nature, but they sort of have happened to enter the aristocracy, which is not really the caste that their personality suits. Right. And that's basically what I'm. So it's basically the same point I'm making there. That we have a lot of sort of naturally communitarian people who have become part of the noble caste and are in power, and that's really unhealthy.
What do you have examples of people like that?
Well, it's well, I want to use now. I've been thinking in terms of Atlas, right? But in terms of real people, I mean, you would have basically much of the sort of much of the left, but also much of the sort of if you look at sort of the university educated quasi-fascist alt-right, right? Both of these are actually cases of collectivist personalities, right? And there are different personalities. I'm not saying that that the far right and the far left are just two sides of the same coin or anything like that. Well, actually, maybe because it definitely does seem to be like a lot of jumping from far left to far right and far right to far left. It's but if you just like think of very sort of left leaning when people want easier and like freer and more universal access to higher institutions of education, basically to make them less exclusive to the aristocracy, then that's basically an example of a non-aristocrat who has happened to find themselves just like usually goaded by circumstances actually into pursuing an aristocratic life. And there's this sort of personality mismatch, because what you really want to do with sort of communitarians is you want to like handhold them through life to a certain extent, right? There's a certain personality type where, no matter how much you try to sort of get them to think for themselves, they're not going to. They're going to find somebody who can think for them. It's, yeah.
What personality traits should like a noble cast member have?
I would say openness, conscientiousness, and disagreeableness.
Okay.
Basically, the communitarians will be people who care a lot about the local community. They care a lot about, they like to go to church if they sort of are unsure about whether something they did was right or wrong. They don't prefer to make up their mind on it for themselves. They prefer to like go to a trusted, wise community member, like the sagely elders, if it's like a migratory tribe or something, right? And or the preacher in the church, if it's like a church community, and ask whether what they did was right or wrong, right? And then if they did something wrong, then the priest or something will tell them, okay, you did wrong. You need to atone by 10 Hail Marys and like whatever, right? Or you need to pay this fine to the church or something. And then they do that atonement, and then it's sort of over, and then they don't have to have this guilty conscience because they've settled it, right? And that's sort of the kind of society they thrive under, where there are these institutions that sort of help them through
How
life.
do you know?
Also pick them up if they're because I know.
How do you know people would prefer this? That sounds like you're suggesting. I'm guessing that the aristocracy is going to be a smaller.
So yeah, a lot of this is from. I know a lot of different people. So there was an earlier episode. I don't quite recall whether it was the previous episode or the one with discussing a Robin Hansen post, but one of the points that was discussed was whether L'Estrade is a cult, and so there are multiple ways you could answer this, and it doesn't really have cult enforcement mechanisms. There's no like turning people away from outside perspectives, right? So in that sense, it's not a cult. But there's also there's this phenomenon, Curtis Yarvin calls it social parallax. It's basically how many different types of people, how many different sort of groups and ways of life do you engage with, right? And L'Estrades and programmers and CS majors like college computer science students, those do not count as separate groups for this because they're basically the same type of person. There's a significant overlap between the sort of person who's a member in these groups, right? But if you if like part of the time you're like engaged with basically Silicon Valley tech culture, and part of the time you're in rural Texas, and part of the time you're like visiting a tribe of Native Americans, and part of the time you're like fishing with some Japanese fishermen, right? You get a very sort of broad exposure to very different types of people, and you get a sense of how they think. So as for like how I know this, it's largely that I know a lot of communitarians. I also know a lot of basically natural aristocrats, and I know a lot of so a lot of it is like direct observation of different types of people that informs my analysis of when and where they thrive.
That seems like pretty anecdotal, though.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean. It's a sort of thing you can transmit actually quite well through fiction, because a lot of people will not that you're supposed to like take the fiction as evidence, but the fiction sort of serves to point out these little glimpses that you've seen in your own life of it, right?
I mean, to jump onto your point, I think that the Harry Potter series, the canon one, was very much communitarian. A lot of it was about fitting into groups and helping your friends,
yes,
and having this identity assigned to you by a hat or by your parents or by whatever
right.
it is. And
so
there's
maybe
nothing
that's
wrong
why
with
I
that.
disliked it so much.
One of the really major differences between the communitarians and the sort of individualists is when the communitarians like business is like falling apart. You should try to help them. You should like help them fix it. Like you should find some turnaround specialists to sort of intervene and help them get back on track. When the individualists, sort of natural aristocrats, when they're failing, you should allow them to fail. And that's a very important difference, because the aristocrats need to have a way of life where their success is dependent on their own competence. Where if they're incompetent, they will fail, and where if they're competent, they will succeed. They need this very meritocratic existence, or otherwise you will get terribly bored and feel like their life is meaningless. And the communitarians need the sense of security. They need the sense that if things go south for them, they will have people who back them up, and like help them get back on track. And this is a very deep difference between the communitarians and the individualists. And the communitarians basically want them to find a community to belong to, and a sort of worldview to participate in, to partake of. For example, a church congregation to join. With the sort of natural aristocrats, they will get very bored of this way of life very quickly. So these things that make the communitarian feel at home are often the same things that will make the sort of natural aristocrat feel bored.
Okay.
And the things that make the natural aristocrat feel excited are usually many of the same things that will make the communitarian feel, frankly, terrified and out of his depth. Depth.
It sounds like an aristocrat is basically a lot more risk tolerant then.
Yes, and a lot more sort of typically career oriented.
Isn't it kind of dangerous to have a very risk tolerant ruling class, though?
Right. So I mean, it's the aristocracy is not the entire aristocracy is engaged with types of governance. There is also aristocracy engaged with with creating great arts and creating industrial projects and so on. And you need to have a certain risk tolerance to just dare to be an entrepreneur. A lot of people would just not dare any kind of entrepreneurship. And there really is something fundamentally entrepreneurial about this sort of about the aristocrat way of life. It's the way you sort of teach an aristocrat to live is basically you throw them into the ocean and tell them to swim, right? And then with a communitarian you don't do that.
Well, we are at an hour and a half. What are like the major things that you would want to touch on without us interrupting you for a little while?
Yeah, I would say just to give like a very sort of quick kind of structured idea of this perspective I'm getting at. It sort of starts with the intuition that the status quo is itself, because the technical topic we were to discuss is why we need monarchy to prevent tyranny, and we've already discussed part of that. Why the alternative is fascism, and of course we all know that fascism is tyrannical. I don't think I need to defend that point, but I would also say that the status quo is another kind of tyranny, and I want to make that case briefly. And I would say that if you're a low-skilled worker, what you see happening is basically USA has this massive trade deficit, and what that amounts to is basically they're outsourcing a whole bunch of their manufacturing, they're outsourcing a whole bunch of their would-be, jobs for the working class. Meanwhile, they're importing a whole bunch of working class members from other nations. So you have this situation where we're importing working class members and outsourcing working class jobs, which creates a very unfavorable negotiating position for the working class.
Isn't this in large part due to, I don't know, maybe we should have a episode where we discuss this, but I've heard that this is in large part due to the minimum wage making it unfeasible to have those sorts of jobs here?
Yeah, it could be. I haven't looked into that particular point, but it's plausible.
Okay.
But yeah, so what we have is this very this working class that really is struggling a lot more than people realize if they don't really if they stay basically in cosmopolitan areas and they don't go outside, because the cosmopolitan areas is basically where the college educated class lives, and it's also where the underclass lives, right? The people who are on welfare checks and the people who are street criminals and the people who stay alive by depending on sugar daddies or something, right? So it's but you don't see a lot of working class people in the cosmopolitan areas. You do see some, but more outside of the cosmopolitan areas, and they're not doing well. They're really not doing well, and the market has a natural mechanism for addressing this shortage of jobs and the surplus of labor, which is to it incentivizes more entrepreneurship, and then an entrepreneur can provide employment not only for himself but for some employees, right? However, we have this massive regulatory stranglehold that makes such entrepreneurship very, very difficult, especially if you're not basically a technocrat, right? If it's very difficult for you to figure out all this regulatory stuff, all these regulations. Because maybe you don't have any lawyers in your family,
it's almost having seen people try to start their own businesses. It's almost a requirement that you have someone well versed in bureaucracy around to help out, because otherwise.
And that's just not the case for like a lot of these working class people. So we have this situation where we're importing a lot of working class people, we're outsourcing a bunch of working class jobs, and we're preventing entrepreneurship. And it's just this very, very terrible, dreadful combination that's just really just squeezing the life out of these poor people. And of course, as you can't really, you can hardly even help noticing that this kind of thing gives rise to populist movements, which are, loud and unpleasant. This is basically why we have the MAGA movement in the first place. It's because these people are really struggling. Or at least a lot of them are. Maybe not all of them are. Maybe like some of them are like college-educated right-wingers who are tired of workisms and are, whatever. But a lot of them are really struggling, working-class people. And so you cannot really fix the situation without fixing a whole bunch of this entrenched bureaucracy, right? All of these New Deal institutions, they worked for a while, but now they're not working anymore. And this like bloated bureaucracy really needs to be cut down to size. The tax burden needs to be reduced. The regulatory barriers to entrepreneurship needs to be reduced. This trade deficit needs to be reduced. We need to stop outsourcing all the working class jobs. And these are things that you just cannot accomplish without somebody wielding very concentrated executive power. You cannot accomplish this by electing a bunch of Trumps in succession. You cannot accomplish this by bureaucratic processes, by instituting a new agency to like reduce the size of the other agencies. Like, it's just not going to work. Like, the only way you can actually change this is by by giving power to somebody who has the desire and knowledge to change it.
You can't do it with a handful of people with surgical scalpels. You need somebody with a giant hammer.
Well, you need somebody with you need I wouldn't say a giant hammer. You need somebody with a scalpel, but it needs to be like a person with a scalpel instead of like a bureaucratic agency with a bunch of like cheap scalpels that break in their hands. But,
Toothpicks.
No, that makes sense. I guess I was trying to think of like a metaphor to say like really like dramatic change, but hammer is pretty destructive, and that's not necessarily what we're going for. So yeah, no, that makes sense. Right on.
So that's sort of the short version of why we need basically a sort of a dictatorship. But that's also the weak case. It doesn't explain why we need a hereditary monarchy. But you can like follow my Substack to to find out more about that.
And if anyone wants to make me king, I'll be okay with it.
But problem is, I'm not much in favor of philosopher kings. And if you're on this podcast, you're probably a philosopher.
Well, I promise to be as ruthless and bloodthirsty as necessary.
No, that's precisely what happens when you have philosopher kings, and that's precisely what happens. So I would say that right now what we have is basically so I'm in favor of the sort of king part of philosopher king, but the problem is right now we have basically an oligarchy of philosopher kings, and it's just not working out terribly well, and it's actually creating quite a terrible war machine, right? It's like people think if you had somebody with executive power, it would be terrible because George Bush and the and the U.S. military, not a nice combination, right? But it's like the Iraq War. Is that just the result of George Bush, or can we think of other ways in which the U.S. war machine has messed up, right? Is this just a phenomenon of giving George Bush too much power, or is this a phenomenon of the American war machine? Right.
I don't want to drag this out too long, but you gave us the pitch for why we need a monarchic dictatorship. I guess that the common working class is really being destroyed, and that can't last very much longer. Can you give us a very quick summary of why hereditary monarchy is the better solution?
So, okay, it's basically if you have very short terms, you have basically an incentive to create as much short-term prosperity as possible, often at the cost of like your nation's productive capital, right? You may create a bunch of projects that stimulate a bunch of employment that goes towards essentially useless ends and hurts your nation's future prosperity, or you like take out a whole bunch of federal debt, right? Endless deficit spending, and like all of these things are things you do if you're thinking very short term and you need to like win your re-election. They're not things you want to do if you have a 40-year reign and then you like pass it on to your son, right? So there are many ways in which we can see the government being short-sighted. So if you just sort of think of all the ways in which the government is behaving in a very short-sighted fashion, I'm saying that basically happens because you don't have somebody who's a long-term beneficiary of government in charge of making decisions. So basically, a monarch should basically take the tax money into his own pocket and then like fund the processes of government out of his own pocket, and so that makes him basically the beneficiary of good government. Because if his nation thrives in the long term, he gets more, tax money. And if he deficit spends, he spends himself into debt that he himself is personally accountable for. And you just don't get that with. Yeah.
What if his motivation isn't, personal wealth? It's something like, I really hate these sorts of people, or I really want to have sex with as many horses as possible, or something.
Well, I think in such a case he could do better than being a monarch. But even then, there's still an incentive for him to have a very stable regime because he doesn't want to be overthrown. If for some reason being a monarch is actually the optimal position for him to be able to do these things, right? If for some reason that's the case, then he wants to maintain the position by that same token, right? And so like he really has a very strong incentive to just make his government work long term.
But if it's not the case that the monarch is the optimal position to pursue his interests, then he's going to make a poor monarch.
Yes, I mean, and hopefully that at that point you'll have some like clever accelerationists or something that can usher in the new regime change. Because I mean, I don't really believe that any form of government is going to last forever. As you know, so Harry Potter calls Merlin an idiot for like having made this system that is sure to go astray eventually, but he doesn't really seem to consider the problem of how do you make a system that is sure never to go astray. It's like it's not actually clear that Merlin could have done better than what he did. Right. And honestly, I'm like, if this regime remains like functional for like, well, actually just for like 50 years, I will be pretty happy with it, because I don't think our current thing is going to remain functional for 50 years. Like, just imagine. Right? I mean, just imagine what this thing would be. It's incredible, right? I mean, we had this, it seems like we're going from one, moral panic into the next, and from one major crisis to the next, right? It's like, it's incredible. And just imagine like 50 more years of this. But if you can have a couple of functional successions, and I don't think that's too impossible, right? If you can have a couple of functional successions, and you might have like 150, 200 years of good governance. And I'm like, I'll take that, even if like in 300 years it like deteriorates. I'm not sure it's my job to come up with a way in which we can ensure that not only do we have a fantastic government now, but it will also still be fantastic in 200 years. And I think these things are related, actually. Like the better our government is now, the more likely it is to be good in 200 years as well. Because this is intuition from Carlyle, actually. This is something I should have mentioned earlier, because it's actually very important. It's the ignoble in the high place. Reverse that. The noble in the high places, the ignoble in the low places. If you accomplish that, then everything is accomplished. Because if there's a problem that you cannot solve by taking the best people and giving them the most influence, right? If there's a problem that cannot be solved by doing that, then it's a problem that's just not going to be solved, right? It's like there's this intuition where the goal basically is you want the best people to have the most influence, and that's sort of your success condition, right? All the rest is sort of secondary to that.
Okay.
And you want that to also remain the case over time, but I think that's largely a result of having this initial condition.
And you think a monarchy would make that more often the case than a
Well,
democracy?
I think it depends on having a good monarch. On having a good monarch in the beginning. Right? You want to start out with as good a monarch as possible. And if you start out with a terrible monarch, well, then it's going to be a terrible monarchy. That's not a good thing. That's not what I'm. Yeah, so basically, I'm advocating monarchy as long as you have a good monarch.
It seems like
If you don't have a good monarch, I don't support it.
The system hinges a lot on having a good monarch, but doesn't the democratic system kind of work okay, even if it has, not great people?
I don't think our current system is working well. I think we're almost on the brink of a World War III, and I don't think these things tend to happen in absolute monarchies.
Was World War I the result of many absolute monarchies clashing?
Constitutional monarchies and the monarchs themselves. You'll see this in Pat Buchanan's book, actually, but you'll also see it in, if you don't like Pat Buchanan because he's too biased, you can also see it in Nichols and Baker's Human Smoke. That the monarchs were actually trying to stop this from happening, and the parliaments and the peoples were just like being crazy and bellicose. But this is of course revisionist history. This isn't sort of the mainstream history, although it's becoming increasingly mainstream in Europe from what I'm told. You can read their breakdown of this situation.
Well, we are getting near the end of this. Real quick, yes. All of us, do you guys have questions a question or two questions each that you wanted to hit about this?
I feel like you're pretty comprehensive. I was thought-provoking.
Yeah, I think I already asked my main questions.
I guess I have one more question, which I must say is not my question. It was brought up in the Discord a while ago, and I don't think there was ever a full answer to it. And it strikes me as a problem, maybe not a problem for society, but a problem for me personally. And so I was wondering how you would think a monarchy would address this. The essence of the question boils down to, I guess it would be, how do we protect the freedoms we really want, which a monarch wouldn't find valuable? But the case given was that you keep saying that a monarch would want a society that is as strong and stable as possible in order to, preserve their own monarchy. And part of a strong, stable society is continued population growth, which is a big problem in the advanced West right now. Basically, all the countries have negative population growth, and therefore, everyone that is in this conversation right now doesn't have kids. A lot of us aren't going to have kids. I've intentionally sterilized myself. I know you're gay. We would both be people that the monarch would consider, I'm assuming, parasites that need to be somehow forced to produce kids or to care for other people's kids or something.
Well, so actually, one of the things I'm discontent with about Denmark at the moment is that reproductive rights for gay people are absolutely atrocious. And I think that's actually something that would improve in a monarchy. And I don't think a monarchy would have a monarch would have an incentive to force gay people to live in straight relationships to raise children, because that's a recipe for a dysfunctional household. They might have done that in a time when people had more religiously motivated homophobia, but I don't think that would be the case now.
What about people like me who have gotten sterilized, or trans people who can't have kids?
Basically, I think forcing people to have kids is a bad way to go about it. They definitely would want people to be productive wherever possible, but I think it's also generally understood that you cannot I don't think tyrannizing your population to only care about the people who produce children. I don't think that would go over very well with the population, and I don't think that's actually a recipe for stability. I think a monarch would try sort of softer ways to encourage having children, like maybe lowered, a slight difference in tax rates depending on whether you have children or not. Right?
Yeah, monetary incentives don't seem to be working, though.
Clones.
Yeah.
Clones. There we go.
I would raise a clone of
maybe
me.
maybe people who have children only pay 5% taxes, and people who don't have children pay a 10% taxes or something, right? And it's I mean, it's it doesn't. I don't think you need to. But I think also just in general, when you have a more functional society, you will have a higher, well, of course it depends on what you consider functional, but if you have a society that's more in the direction of what I consider a functional society, then I think you will have a higher birth rate. I think right now we have basically, pair bonding has been significantly deranged in our society over the years, right? There's basically a little bit of incompatibility between the sort of natural drives of women and men on average, right? So men on average tend to be more promiscuous than women, and women on average tend to sort of marry. I believe Jordan Peterson calls it up and across in hierarchies or something, right? And this difference leads to some dysfunction if you don't have basically cultural mechanisms to encourage monogamy. And if you have those cultural mechanisms, especially actually at the level of the communitarians, so the problem, of course, is aristocrats are sort of high value people, and you ideally want aristocrats to have kids, but aristocrats are also least likely to have kids.
So are you both a monarchist and a monogamist?
Yeah, I generally am in favor of culturally encouraged monogamy.
Okay.
But I don't believe in tyrannizing the population to enforce it. I don't believe in anything like that.
Yeah, no, I got you. Okay. I hadn't expected that particular confluence of views, but it looks like they have some overlap.
I think quite a bit, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, is there anything you would like to say at the end here to wrap things up? Things that you want to address? End it however you see fit.
I think we've gotten around a lot of points already. We're still doing the restaurant first, right?
Yes. Before we do that, real quick, since we're ending the topic here, if people want to learn more about hereditary monarchy and why you think it's a good idea and why you think the current social order is collapsing, where would they go to read about that?
Well, they would. Well, first of all, there's there's Substack that I'm starting out, esoteric musings.substack.com, which will have its first post. The first post will be published by the time this episode is released. In addition to that, I would recommend checking out Curtis Yarvin's greymirror.substack.com and perhaps Hans Hermann Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed.
Huh. Okay. Alrighty. That was quite a bit. Should we jump into the less wrong posts to finish up the episode?
Let's do it.
Yeah.
I don't think there's that much to cover, so it should be swift.
Okay.
But that might just be me, so.
Yeah. I don't know. I had a good time reading them, but who knows how much there will be to say.
Oh, I didn't dislike reading them. I just feel like... Well, let's start with fake utility functions.
Okay.
Which is a historical artifact describing why the next post took so long to write.
Basically that, yeah.
I think that it was a fun read. It was probably even way more fun if you're reading these live when they came out, but I think there's a reason it didn't make it into AI to Zombies, just because it's
more of a meta commentary.
Exactly.
Yeah. I personally really liked it because it started out, with him saying, I want to address this thing where people have found the one great moral principle, and once they've found it, everything will turn out fine. And then he says, it occurred to me that if I wanted to explain this, I need to explain this, and then that turned into multiple posts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's actually it's quite funny because I had an experience very similar to what he's describing in this post. I have a friend who I showed Three Worlds Collide to, and he just didn't really get the idea. He sort of saw and this friend was at the time still he was leading alt-right. I've actually de-radicalized him, or I mean, I'm not even sure. Maybe monarchism is more radical than alt-right, but I've sort of gotten him away from alt-right.
Hey, congratulations!
Thanks. It was actually how I got into monarchism. I was sort of trying to use that as a gateway drug for less Wrongian perspectives, but then I ended up being convinced as well, which I should have seen coming, but I totally didn't see that coming. I didn't even see it as a possibility, but which seems odd in retrospect. But so it was really just intended. It was very accidental. I just sort of intended to use it as a gateway drug for a friend. I would direct him to the anti-reactionary FAQ and state psychotics later. But anyway, so when he read Three Worlds Collide, he was like, well, but the super habits just seem like a superior intelligence, and he would this is the type of person who like Nick Land would have sacrificed everything to Gnon, as Scott Alexander, paraphrasing Scott Alexander, right? He sort of thought, he would have thought that a super intelligent AI being misaligned and taking over the universe would be an improvement over humanity because the super intelligent is a superior species or something.
Okay.
And that was, a holdover from his alt-right days, right? And I was trying to explain what was wrong with this view, why we should prefer this, what in his view was an objectively inferior species, why we should prefer humanity to a misaligned super intelligence, right? But I actually found it very difficult for the same reasons Eliza Zhukovsky is describing in fake utility functions, because I realized, well, actually to explain this, I have to basically explain why,
it's kind of inferential distance.
About utility functions, about how he's basically reifying, evolutionary fitness or something to being some sort of, ultimate value. And it was very, and I sort of realized I was trying to explain it to him, and I was realizing I just cannot explain this over a conversation. I need to get him to read basically the whole sequence in order to get it.
Yeah.
So it was very relatable for me to read this fake utility functions.
Yeah, I loved that the demonstration of how much longer things take once you actually sit down to do them, and the fact that he was not originally had any idea to write an alien god, which is one of my favorite Less Wrong posts, and is insanely influential throughout the whole community. And it kind of shows that you don't know exactly what kind of awesome stuff you're going to end up doing unless you sit down and try to do something, even if you think it's much simpler and you don't have awesome goals. You might accidentally do awesome stuff along the way, which is one of the reasons I always encourage people to always try to do stuff.
Yes, absolutely. People should do stuff. And this is actually one of this idea that people should do stuff. It may sound odd to say this, but that's actually very, very integral to my worldview, and it's one of the things I really struggle to convince people that they should. But
do you think that's more of a? So, would you say that's an aristocratic thing, and communitarians don't strike out as much to do stuff on their own?
No, communitarians also should do stuff. The difference is a communitarian should strive for basically being competent and being valuable to the community. What you'll see with But communitarians naturally do this. You don't need to encourage communitarians that much. At least not if they live in a community. If they haven't found a community, that's when they won't do it. But what you'll notice, if a communitarian becomes like disabled and unable to do his job, right? He'll try to help out in little ways, to like talk to people who need somebody to talk to. He'll try to like comfort people, to entertain, old ladies with conversations, to, find little ways to still be a contributing part of the community. And he's just like, and it won't even be necessarily out of a sense of duty or responsibility. It will just be like from his nature. He just cannot stop, wanting to do something for the community.
Right.
And that's really one of the virtues, this kind of altruism, this communitarian altruism that Atlas Shrugged is a hate polemic against. It really works quite well in these communitarian communities.
Right.
And
I do.
but
okay.
Oh, so communitarians should strive for basic competence, but aristocrats should strive for excellence. Like they should not just try to do stuff, or even just to try to do stuff well. They should try to do it very well, because that's how they develop these aristocratic virtues.
Okay.
And that's where I have a lot of trouble convincing people that they should, hold themselves to higher standards than they currently do, or at least aim higher than they do. Not necessarily hold themselves to high standards, but aim higher and like keep at it until they.
So I mean, yeah, I don't think that's a bad idea necessarily, but I think for most people, just getting started on doing something, even something very simple, can often snowball into much larger, awesomer things. And so doing anything at all, I think, is great. You don't necessarily have to aim high.
Yes. Right. Yeah. Yeah. But also doing anything, like I assume, like what you mean by doing anything isn't just, watching Netflix all day.
Right. Yeah. No. Like,
it's
going
out. It's like actually taking on projects.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I'm all in favor of like if they're not currently doing stuff, like just getting them to do stuff is a massive improvement. And that's also something that's is part of part of my worldview, part of like trying to get people to like have even if it's not like grand ambitions, but just to have some sort of ambition, something they're trying to do.
Yes. But we should move forward.
Yeah.
I did just want to say I really loved reading this summary of like how he ended up in this point, and it was really, really cool to behold. And I wish that he had done it for a lot more sequences, because seeing everything like being pulled in from all the different things he wrote and all stuck into one post, it was like oh shit.
Can kind of see that actually in a lot of posts where a lot of Less Wrong posts contain links to other Less Wrong posts. It's like kind of I don't know. I was gonna say kind of the failure of the format, but like.
Also a feature.
But also a feature.
It's like the spaghetti crawl just through all the links.
No, that was like I would actually almost like to look at this as a mind map or something, but because we can't, we have web pages to look at, and these are words, so it has to kind of mimic a book. But it's I don't know.
All right, well, that takes us to fake utility functions, which is the actual post that he was working to all this time.
Which has the same, like, first two paragraphs.
Yes, it does. Okay, I guess, all right. It basically starts that a utility function doesn't have to be simple. He notes again that a human brain implements 1,000 shards of desire, and explaining that without a very long introduction, like he has written over these months, is hard, and someone's just going to hear humans are trying to maximize fitness, which is the exact opposite of what evolutionary psychology actually says, which I wanted to briefly just comment on, because I do hear that a lot from people, that like evolution, has made us to maximize fitness, which I guess is an incredibly wrong misreading of EvoPsych.
It's an incredibly easy
mistake.
Yeah, it's an incredibly easy wrong answer to come across if you don't understand what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Which, in fairness, it's not taught well. So,
and people also sometimes make it an ought thing, and they're like, evolution, therefore humans ought to maximize fitness.
Right.
Right.
And you see that a lot in like alt-right places, very sort of common era.
Replacing God with evolution, but acting like
Yeah.
it's still, you have to obey it, or it's some kind of authority figure.
But yeah, this is the post about the utility function problem. He points out that if you leave out even one of these 1,000 shards of values from a superintelligence, and even if you've successfully included all the other ones, you could end up with a hyper-extensional catastrophe worse than death. For example, if there's a superintelligence that wants everything for us that we want for ourselves, except human values related to controlling your own life and achieving your own goals, that's one of the oldest dystopias in the book. And he names an actual dystopia book from the 50s.
Yes. Yeah, I might just sort of gesture vaguely at democracy and the New Deal regime as being like very controlling in many ways. But I mean, it could get a lot worse, of course, and it would get a lot worse with such an AI. But,
You sounded like you had a comment, Jace?
Huh? No.
About that thought? No. Okay. So he says, okay, so if you have one amazing simple utility function that these people are saying, is the way to solve friendly AI, like how do they deal with this objection that a simple utility function can't incorporate all these different shards of desires? And then he kind of has a meltdown and says, why would anyone possibly...
It's that they're not used to thinking in terms of utility functions. When most people try to talk about good and evil, what they are referring to really is human benevolence and human malevolence. And these are not necessarily as like difficult phenomena to grasp as explaining the phenomena. It's actually quite plausible that human malevolence could have like a single unified cause without that therefore meaning that we can use our understanding of human malevolence to solve AI alignment.
Yeah.
And I think that's basically what people are trying to think. They're just trying to they sort of misunderstand the problem of AI alignment as how do we keep the AI from being malevolent.
Yeah.
And that's where they come up with one great moral principle, because
don't be evil.
It may be the case. It may be the case that human evil is caused by like one or a couple of things, right? Freud would say Destrudo or some. Well, he would say Thanatos, or no, that was after Freud. He would say like Death Drive, and I think that's a little bit wrong.
I agree. I think that's Eliezer's whole point is that you can't just have one small simple thing, and when he saw the people in his community being like, oh, okay, cool, we've got this utility function, that's what we have to solve, he says, why would they're not searching for objections to their theory. They don't know any of the stuff. They aren't thinking about burdens of proof. They don't know the problem is difficult.
Right.
They heard the word super goal and went off in a happy death spiral around complexity or whatever. And reading further into this post, it seems like he kind of coined this term super goal, which was misinterpreted, and also that his community really fixated on the thing that would solve this is a desire for more complexity. Complexity is good, complexity is interesting, and AI that wants more complexity is going to create a world that we like. And like this post to me sounded like it was born of him having a panic over the community latching onto something and falling into what he sees as a failure mode that could wipe out human existence or make it, an extreme dystopia forever. And I think one of the interesting things to me is that, like, I don't think this is a concern, like, anymore. The AI safety field isn't hung up on, how do we make an AI like complexity? This is what's going to answer this. And yet,
Right.
his freaking out over this solution being latched onto was a major driving factor in the founding of the AI safety field, which is kind of fascinating. Like, at the time, his community was almost the only people that were even thinking about this, so it was kind of a big deal, and now it's a much larger distributed thing. But, like, looking back at this post, we kind of got to see how a small spark of misunderstanding eventually blew up into a thing that is trying to fix AI alignment and is a massive deal in the world. And I think, like, this might be the only time in my life I'll get to directly witness this happening in real time, which, I mean, I obviously not now, 15 years ago I witnessed it, but it was like looking in this with the goggles of looking at history. Like, I didn't know this was what was going to result, that we were going to have the movement we have nowadays and all these genius programmers working on it. It's really amazing to look back on.
Yes. Well, I wasn't in the community when this post was made. I was like 8 or 9 years old when it was when it came out. 9 years old when it came out. So I only read it like 5 years later. I think I read it around age 14. Yeah. So one thing I would say is, I think it's not even necessarily that people's. I mean, sometimes people are just like wrong in their happy death spiral, but sometimes they've actually found something close to a real principle to explain basically the phenomenon of human malevolence, but they're just sort of answering a different question. They're sort of trying to address the nature of evil, which is a very sort of very limited subset of axiology, right? So I like to say that AI alignment is basically a very pure short form of a more general class of problem that I call axiological alignment, which also includes things like, okay, how do you regulate? How should the market be regulated? Right? You have basically the market is a very, very powerful optimization mechanism, but it doesn't quite optimize for like coherent extrapolated volition of humanity, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's a sort of misalignment between this very powerful optimization thing and our actual values, and I call that an axiological alignment problem. And AI alignment is just a very, very pure version of that, because what you're trying to align is basically a god.
Nice.
So what people are coming up with when they're coming up with one sort of complete explanation of evil, what they're really dealing with there is a much more limited problem within axiology. It's just like there's this one kind of pattern of behavior that we see in human beings, and like, what is this about? Right. And I think that's basically what they're answering. And I think sometimes their answers are basically correct. I think Carlyle was pretty close, right? Thomas Carlyle, whom I've quoted earlier. So his answer is basically that when people are sort of, that evil has a lot to do with sort of willful blindness and willful refusal to draw distinctions. Right. There's this sort of concept of
I hate to interrupt you, but we're getting a little bit off topic, and we're trying to stay more on topic nowadays.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. But what I'm getting at is, I think there's actually a sort of mutual misunderstanding here. I think, clearly the people who are giving this, one great utility function or something, one great moral principle of which all other values are a mere derivative consequence. I think they're clearly misunderstanding, what Witkowski is trying to do with like AI alignment research. But I think he may also be misunderstanding, what the answers mean. I think they may sometimes like,
I think they're decent answers if you're a human, but this community was trying to make a superhuman thing, and a decent answer for a human is not going to cut it.
Right.
Yeah, right. It's interesting. I could think of like, a good plausible bad answer might be like love, right? As like the one governing utility to put into something or somebody.
I think you can go very, very wrong with that. Because,
right. That's the thing. Like, you can go like...
Because that's... Well, even with humans, because then you get basically... that's basically the hippie answer. And I'm quite critical of hippiedom. I've seen, I have a close friend who was basically raised in a very, very, very hippie household, like maximum hippie. And it has... he's very repressed now, because like it's related to the sort of toxic positivity often.
It can derange you, but Stephen, you were saying?
Oh, I was going to say, I was going to use human examples because I don't have any superhuman ones. But like, some people might be inclined to like wirehead their kids out of love, or to shelter them from every possible danger out of love, and all of them will just make the kid weaker, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's a quick example to show like the plurality of values that you need to have to like be and help raise a successful human.
Yeah.
Jace, did you have things to pull out in this post? I got like another thing I want to pull, but I've been talking a lot. Me and Cornelius have been talking a bunch, and I wanted to make sure the mic gets passed around a bit.
I mean, not really, aside from just getting along with what the post says, so you can go ahead, Ineash.
Oh, okay. Steven, did you have another thing you wanted to touch on?
No, I think that was the main thought I had on the drive over, so...
One of the things that I wanted to touch on that's mentioned in this post is that the people arguing for their great idea would be like, see, this great idea is justified because it'll promote these things we like love. And Eliezer points out, if you're trying to persuade others or yourself of your theory that the one great idea is bananas, then you would sell a lot more bananas by arguing about how bananas lead to better sex. When really you should be claiming that you should only want sex when it leads to bananas, if the great idea is bananas. And he says, unless you're so far gone into the happy death spiral that you really do start saying sex is only good when it leads to bananas, then you're in trouble, but you won't convince anyone else. And
but I think this still...
I wanted to pull this out real quick because I think this is very interesting in that a lot of people, some people, I don't know if it's a lot or not, have latched on to happiness as their thing and have turned it into
pleasure,
and that leads to
or
wireheading.
pleasure, yeah. And they've like accepted that as I mean, we just had a wireheading episode not too long ago, and then a special wireheading follow up for patrons, but. Like, there are a bunch of people who really do believe that X is only good when it leads to happiness or pleasure, and, like, they've convinced themselves and others of it, and I'm trying to figure out, like, why there's this happiness hack that makes it, like, really easy to hack humans with thinking that, and thinking that, like, oh yeah, we should wire ourselves because happiness and or pleasure is the only thing that matters.
What they're doing is they're basically doing a kind of foundationalism, right? Which is when you try to create a science in the Aristotelian sense by having a central self-evident axiom and then trying to derive everything else from it. I think there's actually a certain value to foundationalism, but I'm also somewhat of a postmodernist, which is odd probably to a lot of people because I'm also a neo-reactionary. But I sort of claim we're all postmodernists now. And if you believe you're not a postmodernist, it's because you don't know what postmodernism is.
I must not know what postmodernism is then.
But, I mean, so of course there's like a strong postmodernism and there's a weak postmodernism. I believe we're all like weak postmodernists.
Okay.
We're not all strong postmodernists. But you know, this foundationalism, I basically have this sort of postmodern take on foundationalism where this is a good exercise for like trying to understand ethics better, like trying to create this very foundationalist system where you have like one axiom and you try to sort of see what happens when you try to derive an entire ethical system from this axiom. I think you can actually learn a lot from that. This is basically how Mises did like his economics. I think you can learn a lot about ethics from studying economics because basically I think ethics and instrumental rationality are going to be like very epistemologically very related.
I do think it's interesting, like, by taking, happiness or pleasure as your foundational thing, exploring that and realizing that it leads to wireheading, but, like, why do people want to have a single one foundational thing so badly?
I think people really like there being a simple, straightforward answer to something. Like,
No, it also makes it seem very rigorous, right? It's this idea that you can derive a complex system from a few basic premises, because then you can basically do
back to complexity.
Pure deduction.
Yeah,
It's like they want to do this pure, rigorous logical deduction from like a few basic premises that they can establish with reasonable certainty. In cases where that can be done,
a lot of these people are very intelligent people that I think should know better and do know better in most other cases. There's just this one thing in particular that ensnares them.
Right, but I mean, it's what it is basically a look for rigor in a very nebulous field, and it's because they are sort of bothered by the nebulosity and they want more rigor. And in fields where you can do this really is sort of the ideal of rigor, to have some premises that you're very, very certain of, and then you derive everything by deduction from those premises. Like, it just doesn't get more secure than that. However, in this case, the field just doesn't work for it.
No, it totally doesn't. I mean, and I think it should be obvious that it doesn't. I have a slightly different hypothesis, which I think you might appreciate considering how you feel about the modern system. I suspect it's just widespread depression that is really fucking people up, and just an overwhelming desire to escape it. And that sort of thing prioritizing happiness to such a degree is a way of coping with that.
That's half of my guess too. Like, being happy is awesome.
Yeah,
I wish
but-
I could feel like this all the time.
Yeah.
Thing is, I see intelligent people make this in other fields than like ethics too. I see people trying to make a music theory, for example, through like one or like a couple of basic premises that just aren't like, and an entire, music aesthetic and music theory and psychoacoustic theory all together from like one or a couple of basic premises. And you can like get some of the way there. You can definitely get some very useful theory out of doing this, but you're just gonna like fall short. And I see intelligent people doing this in general. I think it's just like looking for rigor in.
I think that's what intelligent people do.
Nebulosity bothers.
Yeah.
I mean, we want to pick things apart and understand them.
It's like I think it's
like
a systemizing versus empathizing thing. Do you know, like, I think people who are highly systemizing do this a lot.
It might be
People who
like
are highly
just
empathizing do less.
the ultimate generalized nerd snipe.
Yep.
Try to make it down to the simplest possible foundational.
Man, when I was a little kid, I have these notebooks where I would like try to write my like grand theories of everything that were just totally bonkers, but there's something about it that's, I guess, it's just fun.
Yeah.
So what I like about Les Round is it teaches both of these ways of thinking, because like both the way of thinking where you boil things down, like the very sort of reductionist way of thinking, and also the very intuitive way of thinking. A lot of people who care a lot about rationality, they have, the Daniel Kahneman system 1 and system 2. I forget which one is the slow one.
The slow one is 1, right?
Yeah, so-
slow one is 1?
Slow one is
yeah.
2,
Slow one is 2.
I think.
I hate that they just named them 1 and 2 instead of fast and slow. And I know that was intentional, and it was a bad intention.
System 1 is quick, system 2 is slow. Let's say like system 1 is emotional and irrational, and a rational person relies on system 2. But like, but Yudkowsky is like, no, you gotta like improve both. You gotta improve both your like, both your quick heuristics and also your like slow deliberative, because you use both of them for reasoning, of course. So you need to improve both. And I like that a lot about Les Round, because what you'll usually find is that people learn one or the other skill sets. Like, it's actually very few people who have developed both ways of thinking, both the empathizing way of thinking and the systemizing way of thinking. But the best of Les Round care about both.
Yeah, I agree, which is a great thing about Les Round, and which is why we're reading the sequences. And we will finish this sequence by reading his summary of this post, and basically a large fraction of what he's written up to this point boils down to he's trying to finally explain to people that in the end, the only process that reliably regenerates all the local decisions you would make given your morality is your morality. Which is a heckin' hard thing to program.
Yeah, I think that it's a bit subjective too. I mean, there are people who are pro wireheading, and even they have thought it through, and I just disagree with that, like, down to the core of my being. There's a point where I think that we can't find universal morality for humans, and I wonder how that's going to play into aligning AIs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I care actually a lot less about feelings of happiness, like happy qualia or whatever, than most people do, and including most rationalists. I think I would actually prefer like an explicitly unhappy but interesting, but highly interesting life to a sort of just moderately interesting but happy life.
I think I agree, actually.
I would have to think about that. It depends on how unhappy.
Yeah.
Because there's a level of unhappiness that is hard to bear.
Yes, I think I would still prefer it.
Okay. Well,
which is a bit extreme, I think, but
for next time, we will be reading the posts Evaporative Cooling of Group Beliefs, when none dare urge restraint, and The Robber's Cave Experiment. And one last thing, actually, since we were talking just now about Less Wrong and the community and the posts, please, let's make this real quick because we're running very low on time, but would you consider Less Wrong people to be more like communitarians or more like aristocrats or something else entirely?
Well, when I first got interested, it was definitely very aristocratic. I think it's become somewhat less so over the years. I'm not quite sure, but I definitely get the impression that the community has been somewhat mainstreamed compared to back then. It's still not mainstream by any means. It still has a way higher proportion of aristocrats than in most places. But I think it sort of might be on the decline. Yeah.
Right on.
I wonder, like, people sometimes talk about creating less strong communities and stuff, and it never seems to go that far. Is it probably just because we don't have a lot of communitarians, so we're not good at that shit?
It's a hypothesis.
Question for another day.
So I think actually, on the contrary, I think actually aristocrats tend to be the one to create communities, and sort of, and communitarians don't really know what to do without aristocrats sort of setting working institutions and working communities up for them, and.
All right. Let us end this episode like we end every episode by thanking one of our patrons who are among the most aristocratic of people, for they have the high-mindedness and excess cash to help support us in our...
Oh, that was good.
in our attempts.
At world domination and monarchy.
Yeah, exactly. But we'll get there eventually. Stephen for Monarch, TM.
I'm going to butcher this. Anders Hoytfeldt?
Anders Hoytfeldt, thank you. You the man.
I hope I didn't pronounce your name too terribly. You rock.
Hannes Heidfeld for Monarch.
Yes, exactly.
You have my vote, Anders. Appreciate it.
Right. Now, it doesn't matter if he has your vote, because votes don't matter. He has your support in the military uprising.
That's a good point, yes. I'll throw my hat in behind you. For whatever it's worth, which I guess is not that much. Depending on how many guns you already have.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Anders. And also, again, thank you, Cornelius, for joining us one last time. Can you plug that?
Thank you for having me.
Oh, yeah. Can you plug that Substack one last time? esotericmusings.substack.com. Fantastic. For all your hereditary monarchy needs, we will link it in the show notes, as well as a few other things that he mentioned. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks, Cornelius. Thanks, everybody.
All right, bye, everybody.